Ayacheke, Mishikashi Wenzwiani, Mishikanakwa, Nehe Labidi, Nehe Nawalangwa, Nehe Misoshimi Oimakike, Tepewe Ne Lakoke. As Daryl said, I'm Joshua Sutterfield, I'm a doctoral candidate at University of Arkansas. Little Turtle, Big Legs, Labadee, and my mother, Sherry Sutterfield, are my relatives. It's good to see you guys today. Today I'll be discussing my research that was conducted over the past 6 years while I've been enrolled in a PhD program at University of Arkansas in the anthropology department. My research focuses on the use of cultural space and language as performative tools for the expression or the performance of identity as they relate to the language and cultural revitalization and cultural education efforts of our tribe. In this paper, or in this presentation, I'll specifically address how cultural space, what I call Myaamia space, is created through the performance of a greeting ritual, emphasizing the use of Myaamia Tuwingi, the Miami language. While discussing Myaamia space, I'll examine, in my dissertation specifically, the triple dialectic relationship between language, identity, and space. So I want to start by showing a few of the terms that I'll be using in my work: cultural threads, cultural regalia, and Myaamia space. Through a language and cultural revitalization effort, and through the choices of individual Myaamiaki, certain cultural threads of the community fabric have survived, re-emerging after forced removals, the losses of people and land, and of course, colonization. For me, and in my work, I'm using cultural threads to mean those cultural elements that distinguish Myaamiaki identity from other cultures. They are the boundary markers of our culture. Myaamia culture then can be thought of as cultural regalia, taking all those threads and weaving them in together. As many of you know, regalia is the attire worn by dancers at powwow. From fancy dancer to jingle dress, regalia has symbolic meanings that many times identify the type of the dance the participant performs. Fancy dancers, for instance, can be identified by their double bustles as well as other pieces of regalia that constitute the whole. Each cultural thread is an aggregate in the larger tapestry of the Myaamiaki experience. Be it language, storytelling, we heard from Haley earlier, our games, etc. They come together and create our Myaamia identity, or our Myaamia regalia. These include those threads that have been maintained and perpetuated through the struggles of those who have come before, from both the distant and more recent past. I've heard stories from my elders about meetings that occurred in Oklahoma before the tribe owned any buildings at all, meetings that took place in parking lots and out of cars. Without those informal kind of tribal meetings, basically out of a trunk of a car, threads like these, stories, songs, language, may not have any of our regalia or our identity to cling to today. Those cultural elements that laid dormant prior to and during the rebuilding years owe their existence and reemergence to those people that carried those other cultural threads. As Myaamiaki pick up threads, they become the needle, the instrument which weaves the fabric of culture. Threads come in many types, and there are many little threads that every tribal member carries with them. When they tell Myaamiaki children they are Myaamia, or when they meet relatives in the supermarket and exchange a greeting, we are tying threads together. We are the weavers, the seamstresses, the beadworkers, and the bodies within the regalia. As we pick up threads and embed them in our cultural regalia, that regalia grows. We wear this regalia as we express and perform our identity. Of course, during times of oppression and despair, cultural threads become weak, and some, of course, deteriorate and even disappear. Oops, all right. Through my research, I investigate the threads that Myaamiaki use to understand, share, and create cultural regalia. Weaving the threads and wearing the resultant regalia creates cultural space. So as we do things like speak our language, play our games, we're creating Myaamia space. And it's those cultural spaces that I have used this term Myaamia space. It's in these spaces that Myaamiaki can express, perform, and reinforce cultural identity at different scales, from the individual to the community to the national levels. Myaamia space creates an environment in which Myaamia identity can easily be constructed and expressed, a place that provides a focus of feelings for common identity. These spaces, both permanent and temporary, are created as well as contested as they are differentiated from other spaces. And there are a few key elements that need to be present for the creation of Myaamia space. People. We need Myaamia people to perform Myaamia identity, to create Myaamia space. We typically do this through some sort of cultural action. We need cultural activities, be it lacrosse, song, dance, storytelling. For much of my research, and for this paper presentation specifically, I look at language use, and in more detail in a few moments, the greeting ritual. People, language, material culture, art, music, and many other cultural elements make up these spaces, creating boundaries that separate them from non-Myaamia space. These Myaamia spaces are multi-layered and ever-changing. Without Myaamia space, there is no place in which Myaamia identity can be expressed, reinforced, or perpetuated, which certainly emphasizes the importance of picking up and weaving those cultural threads. The expression and performance of Myaamia identity both creates and is necessitated by Myaamia space. The space and the identity are part of the same infinite loop. So one of the questions I get asked a lot, and of course even ask myself, both academically and personally, is people ask, why? Why revitalize the language and our knowledge system and our culture? What's the reason? And for me, it's simple. It's identity, right? This is our identity. Our regalia, our common heritage, our language, that is who we are as Miami people. We as Miami people have a shared identity, and it is through the expression and performance of our Myaamianess that our identities are felt and realized. I believe that the more cultural knowledge we have, the more ways we can express our identity. In other words, the more ways we can be Myaamia. This knowledge system leads to more cultural activities in which we can enact our identity and thereby create Myaamia spaces. In these spaces, Myaamia people weave the threads of our culture. The loss of cultural weavers and Myaamia spaces led to a loss of those cultural threads, one of the most important of those being language. This has resulted in the need for a revitalization effort, as well as a need to reinvent and reintroduce other threads that have lain dormant for hundreds of years. In order to reinvent cultural threads, there must be places in which Myaamiaki can perform their weaving, to perform their identity. It is these places I call Myaamia space. Throughout my research, I show the importance of Myaamia space and its relationship to language and cultural revitalization and cultural education, while I connect it to anthropological theories related to the performance of identity, memory, and tradition. Theories of cultural boundaries and spaces basically act as my framework for discussing Myaamia space. Frederick Barth's work on social boundaries and his discussion on ethnic boundaries and this othering process has been an essential part for my project. I also look at a comparative religion scholar, Sarah Pike's work, Earthly Bodies, Magical Selves, where she shows the creation of sacred space allows for an easier expression of certain identities. Pike shows that through the use of sacred space, neo-pagans are able to express their real selves, I similarly show how Myaamia space allows Myaamiaki to express their real selves, or their Myaamia selves. The meaning of space itself is inscribed by the actors that use the space. Seth Lowe and Denise Lawrence Zuniga highlight this when they write, because social practice activates spatial meaning, they are not fixed in space, but are invoked by actors, men and women who bring their own discursive knowledge and strategic intention to the interpretation of spatial meaning. These meanings change spaces into what they call places. Pierre Bourdieu notes that space can have no meaning apart from practice. The system of generative and structuring dispositions, or habitus, constitutes and is constituted by actors' movements through space. Furthermore, Lowe and Lawrence Zuniga, using the work of social anthropologist Hilda Cooper, show that value is attached to space through social and personal experiences, and culturally as a conceptual model. I'll be using Myaamia space, that term, in the same manner as these academics are using place. Because as I see it, it is Myaamia actions and Myaamia actors that can change an ordinary space into a Myaamia space, including maybe this building today or this room today. Language use is one of the most prominent ways in which Myaamia peoples create Myaamia space. And it is through a greeting ritual that I see this occur the most. Certainly before I go on, I want to clarify why I'm focusing on language use and a greeting ritual in my paper today. There are a number of ways in which Myaamia space is created and the expression and performance of Myaamia identity occurs. The greeting ritual has many forms, and I'm going to discuss a couple of those in a minute, but in fact, it can be accomplished with just one word. Aya. And you guys have already heard this quite a few times today. A little bit more of an extended version of the greeting ritual looks something like this, and you may have heard this today, or even said this to each other today. Aya ewe milani, our typical hello my relative, Aya ewe milani. Nahaka ingo kiawe, nahaka niawe. Napishi, newe. So many times after this greeting ritual, we'll switch back to English and continue to talk to any other form of conversation that there may be. But the initial greeting is used to not only express one's identity, but to connect both individual identities to a common group identity with shared historical events, kinship relations, and other culturally related experiences. In other words, a common Myaamia identity. For most tribal members, it's at places like powwows, this conference, other cultural events that we have access to other Myaamia people that allow us to express our identity. Current Chief Akema, Doug Langford, once highlighted the importance of people when it comes to performing Myaamia to me once, when he said, he told me, people are the trigger to think Miami. And I just love this quote. In other words, in order to express Myaamia identity, Myaamiaki must first think Miami. Our greeting ritual tends to make us do that. It acts as a key in which we start to understand and think and perform Miami. These greeting rituals and interactions become part of routine behavior that Myaamia people perform. They are part of a ritual system in which identity is created, reinforced, and perpetuated. The greeting ritual provides a sense of continuity with a common past and a space in which a collective identity can be shared and experienced. One of the places I saw this happening the most, where Myaamiaki learn to use the greeting, is right here on campus in the heritage classes. During my research, I spent a year attending these classes again. I did it as an undergrad and graduate student here, and I participated in the classes about 2 years ago. I remember the first class. It began as all other classes did that year with a typical Myaamia greeting. The instructors, be it either Darrell Waldman or George Ironstack, started every class by saying, "Aya cheke, nehaki ngokiawe," and of course the class responds, "Nehaka niawe." The greeting ritual, along with the circular seating pattern, we tend to move all the desks around and create a circular seating pattern, helps change this normal classroom into Myaamia space, a normal classroom where most of the time Western academics is taking place, but we change that into a Myaamia space in order to share our identity. The greeting exercise was an essential part of identity building for tribal students, as it provided a framework in which common identity was invoked, expressed, and shared. The greeting ritual can be used in any location, effectively creating small pockets of Myaamia space. The greeting ritual acts as a key that informs the participants that Myaamia space is being created and simultaneously that Myaamia identity is being performed. It's here that I see us changing our personal space into a shared cultural space. By simply walking up to a relative or any member of the Myaamia community, tribal membership need not apply actually, right? We hear or say the word Aya, we change our personal space into this cultural space. How many people have been looking one way and you hear Aya in the back, you get an idea of who's gonna be back there, right? We're already starting to understand there's a cultural space being invoked, be it a tribal member or one of the many community members here today. Language use in the greeting ritual specifically is one of the most effective ways in which Myaamiaki changed this mundane space into a culturally shared space, or place, as those others have used. So not only can we see the importance of the greeting ritual in the opening of each class period, but also the final of the first semester, the year I was here studying, was an introduction. So for the final, each student had to prepare and recite an introduction in Myaamia Tawingi. Darrell stated that the reason for the final was to express identity. He went on to say, introducing yourself in your native language can have a lot of things tied to it. It's about expressing ourselves as Myaamia people. He says, I wanted you, the students, to have that experience. The introductions varied person to person, but they had a few similarities that parallel a few key elements in the way Myaamiaki people introduce themselves. There were 19 participants, 17 tribal students, and 2 staff members. They all 19 began by saying Aya, which is obviously the typical Myaamia hello. And then they proceeded to give personal information. All 17 students referenced family, every one of them, either by giving a brief lineage of their ancestors, like I did in my introduction, as Darrell did when he opened up the conference this morning, or naming siblings and cousins who had gone through the programs as well. Many of us have relatives that have participated in the heritage class before us or along with us. Naming family and kin is a way to create connections between tribal members and reinforce common identity. Charles Briggs argues that there's a performance of what is called a Sana song performed after the death of a close relatives by the Waro women, that they construct social relationships through the performative retelling and descriptive accounting of relationships. These create kinship and social relations while simultaneously describing them. Myaamiaki similarly create and describe social relationships when performing their introductions, what I consider basically to be an extended greeting ritual. Again, it's important to understand that greeting rituals come in many forms, from the abbreviated Aya Aya, where only a few words are spoken, to the longer introductions just discussed. And again, I want to emphasize, it's also essential to recognize that the use of the Miami language is not necessary to perform the greeting ritual. Many tribal members discuss family members and recount their ancestry and other cultural event participation in English, and just as effectively create and reinforce common identity. When I asked one student about the importance of introducing oneself in Myaamia, he stated this: "It gives you a sense of self. I can at least talk about myself in this language. It's a starting point in my opinion. People introduce themselves and let other people know you are Myaami. It is a way to say confidently, proudly in your own language." And I love this part. "It's also a badge of identity that you can flash to someone. I can speak the language. I know who I am." This is certainly going in the dissertation. It's already in there. But I love this comment, and I bet you, I wonder if my consultants remember if they said this or not. So I'm going to end by sharing a few examples of how I've used the introduction and how I've experienced this greeting ritual. I was at a tribal historic preservation conference in Palm Springs, California. I have no idea, 7-10 years ago, full of Native Americans everywhere. So I'd like to point out that the introductions are a lot of times used in non-Myaamia Native American spaces. Again, let's just have it up there to flash our badge of identity, right? I'm in a space, people are gathering, and there's this one clique of men probably my age, and I can see them kind of feeling me out and looking at me, and I'm doing the same, but they never approach me. I was certainly an outsider. The next day, we're in a room about this full, and people start introducing themselves, and they introduce themselves in their language. 10, 15 people in, someone says, "Thank you for doing this," and then encourages others to use their language. It comes to my turn, and luckily I had learned my introduction in the language. I didn't know much of the language, but I at least knew my introduction, and I introduced myself. I could actually turn around, I could see them like physically looking at me and going, "Oh, that's that one guy." I could tell. After the introductions, there was a short break. All of them came up to me, and all of a sudden I was allowed into their circle. I don't know, and I feel like I might not have been accepted had I not used that introduction, not flashed my badge of my Indianness. Of course, it's also the Myaami-ness. So that's an introduction, and that's how it kind of creates a Native American space versus a Myaamia space. So I'm going to give two other examples of using the greeting ritual. I'm walking down campus, headed towards Upham. I'd been here, I don't know, just a few weeks, so I didn't really know the new students very well. And I see someone sitting on one of the benches. I kind of look, and I think I know that person. I think I know that person. I kind of see them looking at me, and as I get closer, you kind of see the heads going up and down, and you know how you do it. You kind of hide as you're looking. I could tell they were doing the same thing, and it was Ian Young, for those of you who know Ian. And he was sitting on the bench, and I start to get a little closer, and we both say the same phrase, and we do it with that question mark. Aya? Aya, anyway, Milani. And from there, bonded. We were part of the same social group, part of the same community, part of the same family, and the uneasiness just went away. And so just by saying Aya, we created and connected our personal spaces, created this shared cultural Myaamia space. My last story, it was winter. There was snow on the ground, well above my ankles. I just walked to the Walmart from my 2-bedroom townhouse, which I shared with another tribal member. It was a nice walk, I won't lie, it was good. But I got all my grocery shopping done, and I just did not feel like walking home. I just didn't want to. But of course, I'm in the middle of Walmart, and I gotta walk home. Out of the corner of my eye, I see someone at the self-check counters checking out, and I'm like, I think that's George's brother, Matt. But again, I'm not sure. So I kind of sneak up to the edge and kind of linger over and go, he can't see me yet. So I go, Aya Ewe Milani. And he turns around with a smile and a look on his face because I know he knows he's going to know somebody at least a little bit. There is a connection there. And he turns around and says, Aya Ewe Milani. And I think we actually may have done the Nahak Hingo Kiawe, Nahaka Niawe greeting ritual. But instantly, we connected. And it was that point I realized, oh, okay, now I will feel comfortable enough to ask for a ride home. And I did, and we walked to the car, and I actually found this interesting. As we walked to the car, we continued to create Myaamia space in other conversation. We started talking about other events and other interactions with Myaamia people, like Jared and John Bickers. But we did not use Jared or John, we used their Myaamia names. So again, we kept using the language to reinforce our common identity, and indeed making that space easier to negotiate together. The ride home was much, much nicer than anticipated. Mishinewe.